Let's talk about Notre Dame because Marcus Freeman, to me, has now officially fully elevated Notre Dame to a level that it had not quite been at yet before they beat Georgia. They knocked off Georgia. They really did it in the quarterfinals of the college football playoff. We talked about this being a sort of a barrier in the past, right? And what I mean by that is Notre Dame twice made the 4-team college football playoff, and twice they got blown away, right? Once to Alabama, once to Clemson, they got blown away. So to everyone kind of in the college football world, the conversation was, especially during the Brian Kelly years, that Notre Dame was great, right? Fantastic program, incredible, great teams. They produce great teams, great results. Play a schedule that, whether you consider it easy or difficult or whatever you consider the schedule to be, right? They waltz through it, and then if they are undefeated, maybe they're in the playoff. If they have one loss, which they often did, they're probably not. But once they get to the playoff, they just can't contend with those teams that will say play in conference championship games, like teams from the SEC or the Big Ten, or I suppose the ACC as well, if you want to involve Clemson in that conversation. So that was the conversation around Notre Dame. Now, yes, technically those are all semifinal games, and technically those were all, of course, games that they lost, and of course, technically this year in the 12-team playoff, the quarterfinals isn't where there's 4 teams left. So technically they haven't won a game in advance to a round that they had not been at before. But in a different vein, they kind of have, right? Georgia, number 2 team in the country. Not just the number 2 seed, but the number 2 team in the country, officially according to the playoff rankings. Notre Dame was number 5. So this felt like a semifinal game. It felt like the quality of play and then the level of a semifinal game. And Notre Dame won. And Notre Dame won handedly, and Notre Dame dominated Georgia, the SEC champions, right, from the SEC. Very similar to a game in a position that they would be in years ago in the 4-team college football playoff where Notre Dame would lose, and they would get blown away. This time it was the opposite. Not only did they win, they dominated, and they cruised to a victory. Now, of course, Georgia didn't have their starting quarterback, but I partially don't care because I think Georgia is still fantastic. I think that program is still fantastic, and I think the 24-25 team that they put together is still fantastic, and Gunnar Stockton is still pretty good in his own right. So Notre Dame broke through that barrier that we kind of set for them as a program when it comes to the college football playoff. How did they do it? Let's talk about the defense first. Notre Dame's pass rush did exactly what we said they needed to do. They got to Gunnar Stockton right away. They forced 2 fumbles. Both were from Gunnar Stockton. They had 4 sacks, 9 tackles for losses. Notre Dame front 7 was picture perfect from start to finish, in my opinion, especially when it came to flustering that young quarterback, right? Because Carson Beck is one of the best in the country, and he's probably going to go to the NFL and be one of the most highly drafted in the country. But Gunnar Stockton is, at the end of the day, still a very highly recruited guy. And at the end of the day, still a top 2 quarterback at the University of Georgia. But still, Gunnar Stockton is young. He's inexperienced. His only game experience in college at Georgia was, of course, against Texas in the SEC championship game, who still is in the Final Four, right? And then again, Notre Dame. So the 2 teams that he's ever played against, or at least partially, are both in the semifinals of the college football playoff. Notre Dame's front 7 and really Marcus Freeman, this Notre Dame coaching staff, understood right away that you had to get to Gunnar Stockton because once you flood Gunnar Stockton, you're going to fluster him and you're going to put him in a situation where he's going to make bad throws. And on the flip side, the secondary was very effective too because when Gunnar Stockton was put in scenarios where he had to get the ball out, he really had no opportunity because we know that Notre Dame's strength on defense is their secondary despite the injuries that they've suffered throughout the year. The secondary as a whole had 5 pass deflections. It was always going to be tough on Stockton in this game because the Notre Dame secondary was just going to restrict the space. It's not even about picking off passes necessarily. It's about restricting the amount of space that those receivers had. Those receivers couldn't create as much separation as maybe they normally would. And I don't even want to say as much as they normally would, but the point is that Gunnar Stockton at the end of the day is facing one of the top 5 secondaries, one of the top 5 pass defenses in the country, and he's getting blitzed down after down, right? Every critical down, it felt like Gunnar Stockton was under fire. And the second he has an opportunity to throw the ball, who is he going to throw it to? Because Notre Dame's secondary, again, is all over those Georgia receivers. And it wasn't like that all game long. And Gunnar Stockton still honestly managed that very well. But the pass rush was limiting the amount of time Stockton had to throw. And the secondary was restricting his options that he had to throw to. It was complimentary defense. It was complimentary football. And it was absolutely beautiful from Notre Dame. Now on offense, What if I told you that the key to Notre Dame winning this game on offense was not Jeremiah Love? In my opinion, it was Riley Leonard. Because Riley Leonard showed in this game that he truly is a true dual threat quarterback, and he puzzled this defense entirely. Again, what if I told you that they didn't need Jeremiah Love to win? He had 90 yards. Riley Leonard had 90 yards through the air. He had 80 yards on the ground, but he was effective because he had both. He mentally split the defense, and that's really the method of attack, perhaps, that these dual threat quarterbacks have against very strong opposing defenses. Because if Georgia was going to focus on the run, right, if they were going to focus on containing Riley Leonard, he said, all right, if you're going to do that effectively, you're going to have to take some defenders out of your pass coverage, so I'm just going to throw it into the space that you left. If they commit to the run when it comes to Jeremiah Love, then sure, maybe you crash inside and you stop Jeremiah Love, but maybe Riley Leonard keeps it himself, and whether he's throwing it or whether he's keeping it for a run in his own right, that's another, just something else you have to think about. So Georgia mentally was split defensively across all of those possible methods of attack, where Notre Dame would say, all right, maybe we're going to throw the ball downfield. Maybe we're going to keep it with Riley Leonard. Maybe we're going to hand it off to Jeremiah Love. You legitimately have to worry about all three, because we can fully move down the field and fully score and fully beat you with all three. And that's exactly what Notre Dame effectively said to Georgia. And Notre Dame played it perfectly, and Georgia essentially played right into their hands, because Georgia couldn't do the same to Notre Dame, because Gunnar Stockton is a quarterback that, again, doesn't have the experience, would not be able to circumvent Notre Dame's defense in multiple different ways. Gunnar Stockton really had to focus on a few plays, a few concepts, and a few styles of play, really one style of play, in order to beat Notre Dame, and Notre Dame just had way more tools in their skill set. It was consistent dominance from Notre Dame, and that's what's so impressive to me. It was consistent dominance. They had a few pop plays. They had a few flashy plays, a few flashy sequences. Of course, all at the end of the game where they had the substitution trick on Kirby Smart, and that worked. You could argue that's a gimmick that led to them winning. You could argue that at the end of the first half, the beginning of the second half, right? They have the fumble recovery, leads to a score. They have the kickoff return for a touchdown. They score what was it, 13 points in like 50 seconds, something like that, 50 seconds of game time, when you count that kickoff return touchdown, and that's true, and that's fantastic for Notre Dame, right? And you could argue that those are gimmicky, fluke plays, but I think that even if that's true, if you watch this game and you watch every single play and you watch every single down, Notre Dame consistently dominated Georgia and absolutely deserved the victory. They won the turnover battle. Georgia may have had more big plays. Stockton did, at the end of the day, outthrow Riley Leonard, and it wasn't even close. Now, partially that was because Riley Leonard wasn't entirely focused on throwing the ball downfield, and that hasn't been his strong suit or his focus all year. But Georgia just couldn't maintain and finish drives like Notre Dame could. Notre Dame, when they have the ball, right, largely are not making mistakes. They didn't turn the ball over once, right? They're marching down the field, whether it's with Love or whether it's with Leonard. They're marching their way down the field, and they're at least picking up 3 points. And sure, there were plenty of punts, and these two teams traded punts throughout this game, but Notre Dame didn't need to be scoring every single drive, because Georgia was not going to be scoring every single drive, because they couldn't maintain drives the same way Notre Dame could. When Georgia would have a big pop play 40 yards down the field, right, to Arian Smith or whoever Gunnar Stockton was throwing to in a given situation, great. You have this 40-yard completion, but you still need 3 more first downs before you're in the red zone, and Georgia just could not pick up those 3 first downs. Notre Dame played fantastic defense, again, flustering Gunnar Stockton, and then the second Gunnar Stockton has a break to potentially throw the ball down the field, that's when he realizes that he doesn't have receivers to throw to because of how well Notre Dame is defending them. In that way as well, I thought Notre Dame on defense completely thwarted the Georgia offense. I thought Notre Dame on offense, they didn't even win the way they typically win. They didn't even dominate Georgia the same way they dominated Indiana. They did it in a different way, which is very encouraging to me moving forward. And I think Marcus Freeman outcoached Kirby Smart, because I think Kirby Smart, and sure, Kirby Smart had less that he was working with because he had a backup quarterback in and he had to navigate that situation. But Notre Dame, that substitution trick play moment, I think is a great example of Notre Dame and Marcus Freeman outcoaching Kirby Smart. And I think that throughout the game, Marcus Freeman knew how to use his players better than Kirby Smart knew how to use his players to take out the other team, and that's exactly what happened. Consistent dominance from Notre Dame. They knock off Georgia, And looking forward in the tournament, right? They play Penn State in, I believe, the Orange Bowl next up in the semifinals. They're potentially on a crash course for an Ohio State Notre Dame national championship game, because I'm not certain, but I'm confident Notre Dame is favored against Penn State, and I'm confident that Ohio State is favored against Texas. And even if they're not, I don't think Texas is going to be the team that stops Ohio State, right? Texas, to me, is, we'll talk about the college football playoff semifinals later in this episode, but to me, Texas is a team that they're the shakiest out of the Final Four. They're the least strong, least confident out of the Final Four. And Ohio State has just been rolling people and rolling some of the best teams in the country so far in this tournament. So we may be in a crash course for an Ohio State versus Notre Dame national championship game. It was the way that Notre Dame won this game, how consistently dominant they were in every single facet of the game, right? Defense, offense, special teams, coaching. Notre Dame was better in every single way. They won this game with so much conviction, and that's what makes me feel like they're capable of winning it all, because they can win games moving forward the same way that they won them this time. The only team that I feel like maybe Notre Dame would have a very small chance against would be, of course, Ohio State. But Drew Aller, right? He's a quarterback that very much can be taken advantage of. Quinn Ewers, I feel like, very much can be taken advantage of. I think if Notre Dame plays Texas, Arch Manning is playing in the fourth quarter. That's a crazy thing to say, but Notre Dame, I think, just has that ability on offense to younger quarterbacks, to inexperienced quarterbacks, weaker quarterbacks without as much talent. It's going to take someone like Will Howard or Dylan Gabriel, and now that Dylan Gabriel's out, it's going to take someone like Will Howard to really dissect this Notre Dame defense. I think Notre Dame is fully capable of winning it all. I think that this win over Georgia was very impressive, and I'm very excited to see if they can keep it up against Penn State in a couple days, because this might be the best Notre Dame team that we've seen in a very long time.